Covered entities versus business associates. Applicability to biotech. In the complex landscape of HIPAA compliance, a foundational step for biotech companies is accurately identifying their organizational role concerning protected health information, PHI. Specifically, a biotechnology firm must determine if it is a covered entity, CE, a business associate, BA, or potentially neither. This classification significantly impacts the company's legal obligations, the compliance measures it must implement, and the type of contractual agreements it needs to have in place with partners. Here, we delve deeply into the nuances that distinguish covered entities from business associates, highlighting how biotech firms can confidently navigate their HIPAA status. First, we revisit the fundamental definition of a covered entity under HIPAA. Covered entities explicitly include health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and healthcare providers that transmit electronic health information in connection with standard transactions such as insurance billing. Typical examples of covered entities encompass hospitals, clinics, physician offices, pharmacies, health insurance companies, HMOs, employer-sponsored health plans, Medicare, and Medicaid. While biotech companies rarely classify directly as covered entities, given their core functions typically revolve around research, product development, and analytics, there exist clear instances in which biotech firms can inadvertently become covered entities due to their operational activities. For instance, consider a biotechnology firm that provides clinical laboratory diagnostic services directly to patients or healthcare providers. In this scenario, the company actively engages in patient care-related services and transmits electronic health information as part of healthcare transactions, such as insurance billing. Under HIPAA guidelines, this biotechnology firm clearly functions as a healthcare provider-covered entity and must rigorously adhere to the comprehensive provisions of the privacy and security rules. Another pertinent example involves biotech startups that deliver telehealth services, such as genetic counseling or remote diagnostic testing, and bill insurers electronically. In such cases, these startups become covered entities, directly subjecting themselves to the full regulatory scope of HIPAA. Nevertheless, for most biotechnology companies, particularly those focused primarily on research and development activities, clinical trials, genomic studies, or data analytics, direct classification as a covered entity remains unlikely. Instead, these firms frequently fall under the important category of business associates. A business associate under HIPAA refers to any external person or entity performing functions or services involving the use or disclosure of PHI on behalf of a covered entity. Examples commonly include third-party IT vendors, cloud computing providers, data analytics companies, consultants, external accounting firms, or outsourced laboratory services. Following amendments introduced by the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health (HITECH) Act in 2009, business associates became directly liable for adherence to many critical aspects of HIPAA compliance. Under these amendments, a business associate agreement (BAA), a formal contractual arrangement between a covered entity and its business associate, is mandatory. This agreement explicitly outlines the obligations of the business associate, including safeguarding PHI, restricting its use to authorized purposes, promptly reporting data breaches, and supporting covered entities in responding to patient requests concerning PHI. Within biotechnology specifically, determining whether a company acts as a business associate involves nuanced evaluations. For instance, if a biotech firm conducts genomic sequencing or performs specialized analytical services using identifiable patient data provided directly by a hospital or healthcare provider, it typically assumes the role of a business associate. Under these conditions, the hospital, a covered entity, transfers PHI to the biotech firm explicitly for the latter to perform a particular healthcare-related task or function. Consequently, the biotech firm must strictly comply with the privacy and security rules and will typically sign a comprehensive business associate agreement, BAA, with the hospital. These BAAs impose HIPAA obligations contractually, even if the biotech firm might not inherently view itself as part of the traditional healthcare sector. A critical area of ambiguity arises within the research and clinical trial contexts. Clinical trial sponsors, often biotech or pharmaceutical companies, typically receive PHI directly from hospitals or clinical trial sites. Regulatory authorities, including the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, have clarified that a research sponsor does not automatically become a business associate merely by sponsoring research. The key factor here is whether the sponsor performs a function on behalf of the covered entity, such as data analysis for hospital operational purposes, or if the sponsor independently conducts its research activities. Generally, research sponsors conducting independent clinical research for their purposes, particularly where patient authorization, informed consent, is obtained explicitly, are not considered business associates. However, despite this regulatory distinction, hospitals and research institutions often still require clinical trial sponsors to adhere to HIPAA-comparable standards via contractual obligations. This pragmatic approach ensures that the sponsor maintains robust data protection practices, reducing the institution's exposure to potential privacy risks. Another complexity occurs when biotech companies straddle multiple roles simultaneously. A biotech firm could function partially as a covered entity and partially as a business associate or neither, depending on the specifics of each operational unit or activity within the organization. HIPAA allows these entities to designate themselves as hybrid entities, isolating the parts of the organization directly involved in healthcare provision, thus directly regulated as covered entities, from other units performing separate roles. For example, a large biotech corporation could manage an internal diagnostic laboratory as a covered entity, simultaneously run a data analytics division, operating as a business associate, and maintain a purely research-focused unit that falls outside HIPAA's direct purview. Careful delineation through formal policies and procedures is essential to managing compliance in these multifaceted environments. In addition, there exist clear scenarios where biotech firms are neither covered entities nor business associates. For example, biotechnology companies conducting research with properly de-identified health datasets purchased from external sources typically fall outside the HIPAA framework. Similarly, patient registries or direct-to-consumer genetic testing platforms, provided independently of covered entities and directly interacting with consumers who voluntarily share their data, may also reside outside HIPAA's regulatory boundaries. Nevertheless, these companies must remain vigilant, as other regulatory frameworks, such as Federal Trade Commission, FTC rules, or state privacy regulations, frequently step in to fill the compliance void left by HIPAA's non-applicability. Furthermore, once a biotech firm explicitly identifies itself as a business associate, it faces detailed compliance responsibilities under HIPAA. These include full adherence to the security rule, safeguarding electronic PHI, ePHI, complying with the minimum necessary standard, and strictly limiting uses and disclosures of PHI to those contractually permitted. Additionally, business associates must promptly notify covered entities of any breaches of PHI, provide documentation for disclosures, and assist covered entities in fulfilling patient requests for access to their health data. HIPAA also requires that business associates maintain BAAs with any subcontractors who access PHI, extending the compliance obligations and creating a secure, traceable compliance chain throughout the data management lifecycle. This cascading accountability underscores the importance of comprehensive data management strategies and rigorous internal compliance cultures within biotech companies. Firms transitioning external consultants or part-time analysts into full-time positions often find compliance significantly streamlined. When data-intensive roles shift from intermittent, outsourced relationships to permanent internal positions, administrative oversight, employee training, and regulatory adherence typically become more straightforward. Consistent employment arrangements reduce complexity, enhance operational continuity, and foster deeper integration of privacy practices into the company's culture. Ultimately, this shift helps biotech organizations better manage HIPAA requirements and strengthens the overall compliance posture. In conclusion, accurately classifying whether a biotechnology company acts as a covered entity, business associate, or neither is foundational for determining its HIPAA obligations. While biotech firms frequently find themselves classified as business associates, Scenarios exist in which they may become covered entities or reside entirely outside HIPAA's direct regulatory reach. Regardless of formal designation, biotech companies must proactively embrace rigorous privacy and security practices, viewing HIPAA compliance not merely as a regulatory obligation, but as an essential strategic imperative. A robust understanding of HIPAA classification facilitates confident navigation of regulatory complexities, fosters trusted partnerships, and positions biotech organizations for sustained innovation and success within the healthcare landscape. The HIPAA Privacy Rule, Permitted Uses and Disclosures of PHI. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act's Privacy Rule fundamentally establishes how and under what conditions protected health information, PHI, may be legally utilized or disclosed. It serves as a regulatory cornerstone, meticulously balancing patient confidentiality with the practical realities of modern healthcare and biotechnology operations. The privacy rule explicitly states that covered entities and business associates may not use or disclose PHI unless specifically permitted or required by the rule itself, or explicitly authorized by the patient. In other words, confidentiality is the default assumption, and disclosures are strictly controlled exceptions. Central to the privacy rule's architecture is the foundational concept known as the minimum necessary standard. Under this standard, entities must make reasonable efforts to limit PHI usage and disclosure to only what is strictly necessary for a given purpose. For example, if a biotechnology company operates as a business associate to a hospital and is tasked with analyzing clinical lab data, the hospital is obligated to share only the information required for the analysis, potentially excluding extraneous identifying details like patient names or addresses unless directly relevant. While there are specific exceptions to the minimum necessary standard, such as disclosures made directly for treatment purposes, disclosures to the individual themselves, or cases explicitly authorized by the patient, in general, biotechnology companies should anticipate contractual clauses mandating adherence to this standard. Within the privacy rule, several clearly defined categories permit covered entities and their business associates to use or disclose PHI without requiring explicit patient authorization. These permitted disclosures facilitate essential healthcare processes and public health functions while ensuring stringent privacy safeguards remain intact. Foremost among these permitted uses are those categorized under treatment, payment, and healthcare operations, collectively referred to as TPO. Under the umbrella of treatment, entities may share PHI freely to manage, coordinate, and deliver patient care. For instance, a hospital may send PHI to a specialist laboratory to facilitate a diagnostic test required for patient treatment without needing separate patient authorization. Payment activities, encompassing billing, claims management, eligibility verification, and collections, similarly allow for seamless exchange of necessary PHI. Lastly, healthcare operations includes internal activities such as quality assessment and improvement initiatives, peer reviews, medical training programs, auditing functions, and limited administrative tasks like fundraising and customer service. Biotechnology firms often engage with healthcare operations when, for instance, conducting data analytics to support a hospital's internal quality improvement efforts. Provided the biotech firm adheres strictly to the contract scope, such operational activities usually do not require additional patient authorization. Additionally, the privacy rule allows PHI disclosure without patient consent for specific public interest and benefit activities. These encompass disclosures mandated for public health reporting, such as infectious disease tracking by health departments, or reporting adverse drug events to regulatory bodies like the FDA. PHI disclosures may also be permissible for law enforcement purposes, with appropriate legal mandates such as warrants or subpoenas, judicial proceedings, cases of abuse or neglect, organ and tissue donation coordination, and workers' compensation claims. In the context of biotechnology, especially companies developing pharmaceuticals or medical devices, the ability for healthcare providers to share adverse event data directly supports regulatory compliance and safety oversight obligations. Another significant permitted category involves limited data sets. A limited dataset contains partially de-identified information, retaining certain indirect identifiers such as geographical location and dates, but excluding direct identifiers like names, full addresses, and social security numbers. Covered entities may disclose limited datasets to biotechnology firms for research, public health, or operational purposes provided a formal data use agreement, DUA, is in place. This mechanism is invaluable in research collaborations, allowing rich analytical capabilities while maintaining robust privacy safeguards. In certain scenarios, the privacy rule provides flexibility through a concept called opportunity to agree or object. This less formal provision typically involves circumstances such as inclusion in hospital directories or disclosures to family members actively involved in a patient's care, situations that generally have limited relevance to biotechnology firms. Outside these explicitly permitted uses, any other PHI disclosure demands a formal patient authorization. Authorization is not a general consent. Instead, it is a detailed written permission specifying precisely what PHI will be shared, with whom, for what purpose, its duration, and includes the patient's signed approval. Typical situations necessitating authorization include the use of PHI in commercial research activities, unless an IRB waiver applies, marketing purposes, or the outright sale of PHI. Biotechnology companies planning to utilize PHI in novel commercial research applications or direct patient marketing must ensure that each use is explicitly authorized by affected individuals. Regarding marketing and sale restrictions specifically, HIPAA explicitly forbids marketing communications utilizing PHI without authorization unless they are directly related to healthcare services offered by the entity itself or general health management information. Any commercial transaction involving PHI, defined broadly under HIPAA as the sale of PHI for remuneration, requires explicit patient authorization unless one of the narrow exceptions, e.g., public health reporting or cost reimbursement research scenarios, applies. This rule severely restricts biotechnology firms from acquiring PHI from covered entities purely for patient recruitment into clinical trials or for targeted marketing efforts without patient consent. Research disclosures under the privacy rule carry additional nuanced provisions. PHI can be disclosed for research purposes under certain stringent conditions without explicit patient authorization. First, covered entities may disclose PHI if an institutional review board, IRB, or privacy board grants a waiver of authorization. Such waivers generally require that the research pose minimal privacy risk, that the research could not practicably be conducted without PHI, and that appropriate privacy safeguards are in place. Second, PHI may be shared in a limited dataset format, again, subject to a data use agreement. Third, activities preparatory to research, such as identifying patient cohorts or feasibility studies, permit PHI access provided data remains within the covered entity's custody. Lastly, PHI of deceased individuals may be used for research with appropriate assurances that it relates solely to decedents. For biotechnology firms conducting retrospective data analyses or clinical trials, these research-specific exceptions frequently represent critical avenues for compliant PHI access without direct patient consent. In practice, biotechnology companies should adhere to several critical operational guidelines under the privacy rule. First, always classify the intended use of PHI clearly and upfront. Is it treatment, payment, healthcare operations, research, or commercial? Clarifying the use case directly informs the necessary compliance approach. Second, consistently apply the minimum necessary standard by proactively working with data providers to limit data exposure to only essential elements. Third, maintain strict documentation of authorizations or waivers for PHI disclosures not otherwise permitted. Fourth, biotechnology companies must be cognizant of the Notice of Privacy Practices, NPP, distributed to patients by covered entities, ensuring that the intended data usage aligns with what patients have been informed about or ensuring explicit authorization is obtained. In sum, the HIPAA privacy rule sets clear yet flexible boundaries governing PHI use and disclosure. Biotechnology companies must navigate these regulations carefully, leveraging permitted use categories, obtaining necessary authorizations, or employing data minimization practices. Rigorous adherence to these guidelines not only ensures regulatory compliance, but also establishes trust, bolsters organizational credibility, and fundamentally supports ethical and responsible data stewardship. Individual rights under HIPAA, patient access, privacy notices, and more. The HIPAA privacy rule is frequently associated with data flow restrictions and permissible disclosures of protected health information, PHI. Yet, at its core, HIPAA is fundamentally centered around patient empowerment. It grants individuals significant rights regarding access to, control over, and transparency about their own health information. For biotechnology companies, particularly those operating as business associates, BAs, understanding these individual rights is vital, not only for compliance but also for fostering patient trust and robust data governance practices. This lecture examines these key patient rights comprehensively, highlighting how biotech firms might encounter and navigate them effectively. One of the most critical patient rights under HIPAA is the right of access. Individuals possess the explicit right to access, inspect, and obtain a copy of their PHI maintained within a covered entity's designated record set. Typically, this record set comprises clinical records, laboratory results, diagnostic tests, medical notes, billing information, and other documents directly related to patient care. Importantly, the privacy rule mandates that covered entities provide patients with their requested information within 30 days of receipt, with a possible one-time extension of an additional 30 days if explicitly justified. Additionally, entities may only charge patients a reasonable cost-based fee covering expenses related to copying or preparing the requested information. Recent enforcement trends from the Office for Civil Rights, OCR, including the high-profile Right of Access initiative, underscore the importance of timely compliance. Organizations have faced significant monetary penalties for failing to promptly fulfill patient requests. For biotech firms, this right becomes particularly relevant when they function as covered entities, such as diagnostic laboratories or genomic testing providers. Such biotech organizations must be prepared to respond promptly to patients requesting copies of their test results or other health records. Similarly, biotech companies operating as business associates should anticipate contractual obligations through business associate agreements, BAAs, compelling them to assist covered entities in fulfilling these patient requests swiftly and comprehensively. While the right of access is broad, certain exceptions exist. Psychotherapy notes maintained separately by mental health professionals, or PHI compiled explicitly in anticipation of legal proceedings, are typically exempted from disclosure. Additionally, a healthcare provider may deny access if they reasonably believe disclosure might endanger the life or safety of the patient or another individual. However, such denials must be reviewed by another licensed healthcare professional at the patient's request, ensuring a balanced, transparent decision-making process. The right to amend. Records further underscores patient empowerment. Individuals who discover inaccuracies or incomplete information in their medical records can formally request an amendment. Covered entities receiving such requests must review them diligently. If the request is valid, corrections must be made, and relevant stakeholders must be informed to ensure that future decisions reflect accurate information. Conversely, if the entity declines to amend the record, such as if the record is deemed accurate or originates from another source, the entity must allow the patient to attach a statement of disagreement to the record. This statement must accompany the original record for future disclosures, ensuring patient perspectives remain visible. For biotech companies maintaining PHI received from covered entities, this right implies a procedural obligation. If notified by a healthcare partner that a patient's record has been amended, the biotech company must swiftly update its own records to remain aligned with the corrected information. The right to an accounting of disclosures allows patients to request a historical log of disclosures of their PHI over the preceding 6 years. Notably, this right excludes disclosures made for treatment, payment, or healthcare operations, collectively known as TPO. Disclosures made directly to the patient, or disclosures authorized explicitly by the patient. Instead, it primarily captures disclosures made for public health reporting, regulatory compliance, or law enforcement purposes. For biotech firms operating as BAs, this means maintaining accurate logs of disclosures made on behalf of their covered entity partners, ensuring readiness to respond promptly should a covered entity request disclosure documentation as part of a patient accounting request. The right to request restrictions provides individuals with the ability to ask covered entities to limit PHI usage or disclosure under certain conditions. Covered entities are generally not obligated to agree to requested restrictions, except in one critical scenario. If an individual pays out of pocket in full for a healthcare service, they can demand that the provider refrain from sharing that particular PHI with health insurers. Although biotech companies rarely encounter this scenario directly unless acting as healthcare providers themselves, awareness remains crucial, particularly when designing data management systems or engaging in collaborative clinical studies involving sensitive information. Additionally, the right to confidential communications allows patients to request alternative communication methods or locations to protect privacy. For instance, receiving bills at work rather than at home, or being contacted only via mobile phone rather than home landlines. Covered entities must accommodate reasonable requests, thus biotech companies, especially those directly communicating with patients as part of clinical trials or patient registries, must honor such preferences diligently. Covered entities must clearly communicate these preferences to biotech business associates involved in patient-facing communications. Another crucial mechanism reinforcing patient empowerment is the Notice of Privacy Practices, NPP. HIPAA requires all covered entities, providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses to furnish patients with an NPP explicitly detailing how their PHI is used, patients' rights, the entity's duties regarding PHI, and the appropriate contacts for privacy-related concerns or complaints. Patients typically acknowledge receiving this notice, though such acknowledgement is not a prerequisite to receiving care. Although biotech firms acting solely as BAs do not issue NPPs themselves, they must remain acutely aware of the commitments made in their partners' notices. Violating assurances stated within an NPP can compound regulatory exposure and damage patient trust significantly. Complementing these individual rights are robust administrative requirements mandated by HIPAA. Covered entities, and by extension their business associates, must establish and maintain comprehensive written policies and procedures explicitly addressing HIPAA compliance. Entities must also implement workforce training programs to ensure ongoing employee awareness and compliance with HIPAA's requirements. Importantly, entities are obligated to mitigate any identified harm from HIPAA violations and enforce compliance through documented sanction policies applicable to workforce members who violate HIPAA standards. Furthermore, HIPAA strictly prohibits retaliation against individuals exercising their privacy rights or filing complaints about privacy practices. Biotechnology firms interacting with PHI must thus have clear, documented internal protocols for handling patient requests, managing disclosures, updating records, and documenting compliance efforts diligently. Record retention constitutes another essential administrative requirement under HIPAA. Documentation of privacy policies, training programs, disclosures logs, and records pertaining to patient requests and their disposition must be retained for at least 6 years from the date of creation or the last effective date, whichever occurs later. Such meticulous documentation practices not only ensure regulatory compliance but also support internal audits, OCR investigations, and mitigate organizational risk. The overarching purpose of HIPAA's robust framework of patient rights and associated administrative requirements extends far beyond regulatory adherence. It serves to build patient trust and foster an organizational culture deeply committed to privacy and transparency. For biotech companies, respecting patient rights enhances their reputation among patients, research participants, clinical collaborators, regulators, and the public at large. Demonstrating proactive compliance and robust respect for patient autonomy differentiates organizations in competitive marketplaces, fostering higher patient participation rates in clinical trials, improving patient satisfaction and retention, and ultimately enabling deeper insights and innovation. In conclusion, biotechnology companies, whether covered entities themselves or operating primarily as business associates, must possess comprehensive knowledge of patient rights enshrined within the HIPAA privacy rule. Proactively preparing to facilitate these rights through meticulous record-keeping, clear procedural frameworks, and robust employee training is imperative. These practices are not merely regulatory checkboxes, but critical components of ethical data governance, patient trust, and long-term organizational success in the complex landscape of healthcare innovation and biotechnology research. Understanding the HIPAA privacy rule. Comprehensive principles for biotech companies. The HIPAA privacy rule, enacted as part of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996 and enforced since 2003, represents a cornerstone of patient data protection in healthcare and biotechnology settings. It establishes federal standards to ensure the confidentiality of protected health information, PHI, guiding how organizations may lawfully use, disclose, and manage health data. For biotechnology companies navigating complex research and business relationships, an intricate understanding of the privacy rule is not merely advisable, it is strategically critical. At its core, the privacy rule was designed to provide comprehensive protection for individuals' personal health information, while simultaneously permitting necessary disclosures that support healthcare delivery, billing, and operational efficiency. It applies explicitly to covered entities, healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses, and to their business associates, including many biotechnology companies receiving PHI to perform services like genetic testing, clinical analytics, or patient data management. The privacy rule sets foundational principles around permissible uses and disclosures of PHI, stipulating that such disclosures are allowed without patient consent in specific, narrowly defined circumstances, notably for treatment purposes, payment processing, and healthcare operations. For instance, hospitals can share patient records with a biotech firm, performing clinical analyses to evaluate treatment effectiveness, provided that the disclosure is directly tied to these permitted healthcare operations. However, beyond these specific circumstances, any disclosure typically necessitates explicit patient authorization. Biotechnology companies, therefore, must remain vigilant about obtaining appropriate authorizations or ensuring their activities clearly fall under permitted exceptions. Moreover, the privacy rule mandates that organizations adhere strictly to the minimum necessary standard. This standard obligates covered entities and business associates to restrict PHI disclosures to the minimum amount of data required to achieve the intended purpose. In practical terms, if a biotech firm requests health records for genetic sequencing from a partnering hospital, it must explicitly limit its data request to only the necessary fields, excluding extraneous identifiers or unrelated patient history. The intent behind this is to mitigate privacy risks by reducing unnecessary exposure or dissemination of sensitive patient information. Biotechnology firms also need to understand the patient rights codified within the privacy rule. These rights empower patients significantly, providing individuals with unprecedented levels of control over their own health information. Specifically, patients hold the right to access their PHI, request amendments or corrections to their health records, request restrictions on certain uses or disclosures of their data, and receive an accounting of disclosures made by entities that hold their PHI. Consequently, biotech companies must maintain meticulous records of PHI disclosures, as patients can demand to review these logs. Moreover, organizations must develop robust administrative protocols for handling patient requests, ensuring timely responses and complying with patient-directed restrictions where feasible. In the context of biotechnology research, a particularly nuanced aspect of the privacy rule involves research uses of PHI. Typically, research-related uses and disclosures of PHI require explicit patient authorization unless they qualify under carefully defined exceptions. For example, biotech companies can use PHI without explicit authorization if the data is adequately de-identified according to HIPAA standards, or if an institutional review board, IRB, or privacy board has approved a waiver of authorization based on stringent criteria. For biotech firms, understanding the precise mechanics of data de-identification including removal of HIPAA's 18 identifiers, or gaining IRB approvals for waiver of authorizations becomes a crucial operational capability, enabling compliant, privacy-respectful research without burdensome authorization requirements. Additionally, biotechnology companies need to recognize the complexity surrounding re-identification risks. While HIPAA permits use of de-identified data without restriction, the threshold for acceptable de-identification is stringent. A dataset seemingly anonymized might inadvertently retain elements, such as rare genetic markers or geospatial data, that could allow sophisticated entities to re-identify individual patients. Hence, biotech firms must rigorously assess datasets through statistical and technical methods, verifying that data truly meets the legal standard of being non-identifiable before proceeding without explicit patient consent. Furthermore, understanding permitted exceptions for public health reporting, law enforcement disclosures, and certain other scenarios where PHI disclosure without patient consent is mandated or allowed is essential. Though less common in typical biotech operations, awareness of these permitted exceptions ensures that companies remain compliant when encountering exceptional disclosure scenarios. Biotechnology companies must implement strong organizational practices and training programs designed explicitly to ensure privacy rule compliance. This includes developing comprehensive privacy policies, conducting regular employee education, establishing clear administrative processes for managing patient rights requests, and implementing strict audit protocols to monitor compliance proactively. Companies must appoint privacy officers, mandated under HIPAA, to oversee these activities, ensure accountability, and serve as internal resources for addressing complex privacy questions or compliance dilemmas. Now, reflecting strategically on the privacy rules' implications for workforce management and operational flexibility, biotech firms frequently collaborate closely with partners, consultants, or contractors. Such relationships, often less formal than full-time employment, still require stringent privacy rule adherence. However, when considering deeper integration of key individuals into biotech operations, such as shifting from intermittent consultancy to full-time roles, compliance complexity may significantly diminish. Transitioning a consultant or contractor to full-time employment can streamline compliance efforts, centralizing oversight and simplifying contractual arrangements. For instance, a woman serving intermittently in a consultancy or contractor capacity, dedicating perhaps 1 day per week to highly sensitive data-intensive work, faces considerable complexity in ensuring compliance with the privacy rule. Sporadic engagement necessitates robust safeguards, extensive compliance protocols, and stringent oversight, increasing administrative burden and compliance complexity. However, transitioning the same individual into a full-time role can significantly simplify these challenges. Full-time integration provides a singular point of oversight, clearer organizational accountability, and more streamlined data management practices. Compliance monitoring and data control become centralized and consistent, reducing risks associated with intermittent or fragmented work arrangements. Importantly, the frequency and intensity of engagement, such as working 8 to 10 hours daily, 5 days per week, substantially enhances familiarity with compliance procedures, protocols, and organizational culture. Routine and continuous involvement naturally cultivates heightened compliance awareness, significantly reducing inadvertent privacy violations. Conversely, even a single intensive weekly engagement, consistent and clearly defined, can similarly reinforce compliance culture and reduce privacy risks compared to irregular or infrequent interactions. On the personal level, intensive and consistent engagement within compliance-rich environments naturally fosters increased professionalism, data awareness, and operational precision. Individuals, especially women professionals, working closely and consistently within complex regulatory frameworks such as HIPAA, typically exhibit increased operational confidence, compliance proficiency, and reduced anxiety regarding inadvertent compliance violations. This consistency not only reinforces professional development, but also stabilizes and enhances overall organizational compliance posture. In conclusion, mastering the privacy rule is indispensable for biotech firms navigating healthcare data use responsibly and strategically. Clear understanding of permitted disclosures, patient rights, research-specific conditions, data de-identification standards, and operational integration considerations provides a strong compliance foundation. Furthermore, companies must recognize that integrating key personnel, especially into full-time, consistent engagements, dramatically simplifies compliance complexity, enhances operational effectiveness, and fosters robust privacy cultures, ultimately enabling greater innovation and strategic growth within biotechnology.